The war began at sea, but it was decided on land. On October 2nd at 0541 local time, multiple commercial vessels reported sudden navigation restrictions in the eastern Black Sea. The notices were brief, unsigned, and already obsolete by the time captains received them. Naval traffic surged regardless. Warships had moved first. By 0612, Turkish naval units were operating well beyond declared exercise zones, forming layered patrols along critical transit routes. Radar emissions spiked. Helicopters lifted repeatedly from decks, hovering low before returning. The posture was defensive in language and coercive in geometry. Russia responded within the hour. Surface combatants sorted from Sevastopol and Novorossiysk under full readiness. Missile boats dispersed into coastal waters, submarines repositioned silently. The Black Sea narrowed rapidly, not by distance, but by intent. At 0827, the first air intercept occurred. A Russian maritime patrol aircraft shadowing Turkish vessels was intercepted by two fighters operating aggressively within international airspace. Visual passes were close, flares were deployed, radar locks hardened briefly, then disengaged. No weapons were fired. The encounter lasted 7 minutes and was recorded from multiple angles. By noon, Ukraine was no longer peripheral. Russian ground units along the southern front increased artillery activity, striking infrastructure nodes and forward positions simultaneously. The barrage was short, precise, and coordinated. Ukrainian forces returned fire immediately. The exchange spread across multiple sectors within hours. At 1403, the first missile struck a military target on land. A precision strike hit a logistics hub near the coast, destroying fuel storage and transport vehicles. Casualties were confirmed among personnel. No claim of responsibility was issued, none was needed. Turkey elevated its military posture nationwide before sunset. Air bases shifted to wartime operations, aircraft were dispersed, naval infantry units mobilized along the coast. The Bosphorus remained open, but under unmistakable control. The following night, the conflict widened again. On October 3rd at 0118, Ukrainian forces reported Russian armored movements toward key junctions inland, supported by sustained air activity. The advance was not deep, but it was deliberate. Defensive lines were tested, not breached. NATO forces began moving east before dawn. Units from multiple countries crossed internal borders under the framework of defensive reinforcement. The deployment was described as precautionary. The scale suggested otherwise. Rail yards filled with armor. Convoys rolled without pause. At sea, the first exchange occurred. At 0954, Turkish and Russian surface groups maneuvered within visual range south of Crimea. Warning broadcasts were ignored. Naval guns tracked targets. Radar control radars activated intermittently. The standoff lasted nearly 4 hours. At 1331, a missile was launched. The weapon did not target a ship. It detonated at altitude, scattering debris and briefly saturating sensors across the formation. It was a warning, calculated, visible, and impossible to ignore. The response was immediate. Defensive systems activated across multiple vessels. Aircraft launched from both sides. The sky filled with contrails and electronic noise. Still no direct hits, still no retreat. By evening, the Black Sea was no longer a theater of tension. It was a theater of war in all but name. On land, fighting intensified overnight. Artillery duels expanded. Armored units clashed near contested roads. Control shifted village by village. Casualty reports lagged behind reality. By October 4th, global attention fixed on one question. If the Black Sea closed, and if ground fighting continued to expand, how long before others were forced to choose sides? The Third World War had not been declared, but for the first time, no one was asking whether it would begin, only where the next line would break. By October 5th, The conflict had shed its remaining ambiguity. What had begun as coercive maneuvering at sea now unfolded as coordinated operations across air, land, and coastline. Decisions were no longer framed as deterrence, they were framed as necessity. At 04:22 local time, Russian forces initiated a synchronized strike cycle along the southern front. Artillery fire intensified across multiple sectors simultaneously, followed by armored probes aimed at testing Ukrainian defensive depth. The advances were limited in scope but relentless in tempo. Units pressed forward, disengaged, and shifted axes within hours, forcing defenders to redeploy continuously. Turkey responded at sea. Naval task groups moved eastward in overlapping formations, extending patrol lines toward the central Black Sea. Anti-ship systems were brought to full readiness. Helicopters operated continuously, dipping low before returning to decks. The geometry of movement signaled intent: deny space, not seize it. The first sustained naval engagement occurred at 10:47. Russian missile boats operating under coastal cover attempted to push south, probing Turkish screens. Defensive fire activated immediately. Missiles were launched in short salvos. Several were intercepted over open water. One struck near a support vessel, causing damage but not disabling it. Both sides disengaged after 40 minutes, repositioning without claim of success. In the air, the fight escalated faster. Throughout the afternoon, Russian and Turkish aircraft conducted overlapping patrols at increasingly aggressive distances. Intercepts became confrontations. Flares deployed repeatedly. Pilots reported hardened locks and brief missile seeker tones before countermeasures broke contact. 2 aircraft were damaged during evasive maneuvers and forced to land. No losses were officially acknowledged. On land, Ukraine absorbed the weight of escalation. By evening, Russian armored units committed additional forces along a key inland axis, aiming to disrupt logistics routes feeding the front. Ukrainian commanders countered with mobile reserves and concentrated artillery, slowing the advance but failing to halt it completely. Control of several towns shifted twice within 12 hours. Civilian movement ground to a halt. Power disruptions spread across coastal regions as infrastructure took cumulative damage. Evacuation corridors clogged. Emergency services operated under constant strain. Governments issued reassurances that changed nothing on the ground. NATO crossed another threshold before dawn on October 6th. All Allied air forces expanded operations over the Black Sea's western approaches. Patrols transitioned from observation to active coverage. Rules of engagement were adjusted quietly. The alliance still avoided formal declarations. The battlefield did not. At 07:31, a coordinated strike hit multiple military installations near the coast. The targets were logistical: fuel depots, transport nodes, command facilities. The strikes were precise and timed within minutes of each other. Russian air defenses intercepted several munitions. Others reached their objectives. Damage assessments were incomplete by nightfall. The response was swift. Russian forces launched retaliatory strikes against forward bases supporting the expanded air presence. Interceptors engaged continuously. Runways were cratered and repaired under fire. Aircraft were dispersed to secondary fields. Operations continued with reduced efficiency. At sea, the Black Sea entered a new phase. By midday, surface combatants from both sides operated within overlapping engagement envelopes across a broad arc. Missile systems remained active. Fire control radars cycled on and off. Commanders maneuvered aggressively to gain advantage without committing to decisive exchange. At 16:18, restraint failed briefly. A missile launched during a chaotic exchange struck a patrol vessel operating near the edge of the formation. The ship was damaged and forced to withdraw under escort. Casualties were confirmed. The incident lasted seconds. Its consequences reshaped the night's operations. Air activity surged after sunset. Strike aircraft flew repeated sorties against advancing ground units and coastal positions.
Air defenses lit the sky intermittently. Several engagements occurred at low altitude as pilots pressed attacks under threat. Losses mounted quietly on all sides. By October 7th, the conflict had outgrown its origin. The Black Sea was contested. Ground fighting intensified inland. Airspace across multiple countries fractured into controlled corridors. Shipping halted almost entirely. Energy markets reacted sharply. Diplomatic channels strained under the weight of events they no longer guided. What remained was momentum. Each side believed the next push could force the other to pause. Each side calculated that hesitation now would be irreversible later. The Third World War still had no declaration, but by the end of the week it had something far more dangerous: a rhythm.
By October 8th, the conflict entered its most violent phase. What restraint had survived the first days was consumed by the need to seize initiative. Commanders no longer planned for weeks ahead, they planned for the next 12 hours. The decisive escalation began before dawn. At 0411 local time, Russian forces launched a coordinated multi-domain push designed to overwhelm Ukrainian defenses and disrupt NATO's growing operational footprint in the region. Artillery barrages struck simultaneously along multiple inland axes. Armored formations advanced under cover of smoke and electronic countermeasures. The objective was clear: break cohesion before reinforcements could stabilize the front. Ukrainian forces responded with urgency. Mobile artillery units displaced constantly, firing and relocating within minutes. Anti-armor teams engaged lead elements, slowing advances but suffering heavy pressure. Several defensive lines bent but did not collapse. Fighting spread rapidly into semi-urban terrain where control shifted block by block. At sea, escalation arrived with less warning. Shortly after 7 o'clock, Russian surface groups executed a high-risk maneuver, pushing aggressively into contested waters under layered air cover. Missile boats advanced at speed, supported by shore-based systems. The move forced Turkish naval commanders to choose between withdrawal and confrontation. They chose neither. Instead, Turkish forces surged forward to meet the advance. Missile systems activated across the formation. Aircraft launched from coastal bases to provide immediate cover. Within minutes, the Black Sea witnessed its largest naval engagement of the conflict. Missiles were launched in rapid succession. Interceptors rose from multiple decks. Defensive systems strained under volume. Several missiles detonated mid-air, others struck water or decoys. One impacted a major surface combatant, crippling it and forcing evacuation of key sections. Fires burned uncontrolled for hours as escorts maneuvered to shield the damaged vessel. The engagement lasted nearly 3 hours. By mid-morning, both sides disengaged without decisive outcome. Several ships were damaged, at least one was lost. Casualty figures were withheld, but the scale was unmistakable. In the air, the battle intensified further. Throughout October 8th, strike aircraft operated at the edge of survivability. Low-altitude runs replaced high-altitude patrols as air defenses saturated the sky. Pilots pressed attacks against logistics hubs, bridges, and advancing columns. Losses mounted rapidly. Recovery operations became increasingly dangerous. On land, the consequences were immediate. Russian advances slowed under sustained air and artillery pressure. Ukrainian reserves counterattacked along key junctions, retaking ground lost earlier in the day. The front stabilized temporarily, but at enormous cost. Entire battalions were rendered combat ineffective within hours. By evening, the war widened again. Missile strikes hit targets far from the immediate front, including transportation infrastructure critical to regional movement. Rail yards burned, fuel depots ignited. The strikes were calculated to disrupt, not destroy, but the effect rippled across borders. NATO's posture shifted visibly that night. Additional air defense systems deployed across southeastern Europe.
naval forces repositioned beyond the Black Sea's western approaches. Intelligence and logistics operations expanded dramatically. The alliance still avoided formal declarations, but the scale of involvement could no longer be described as indirect. The most dangerous moment came just after midnight on October 9th. Early warning indicators across multiple countries suggested preparations for strikes beyond conventional scope. Strategic command centers elevated readiness. Communication lines lit up across capitals. For several minutes, escalation scenarios dominated every calculation. Then the indicators faded. Whether the signals were misinterpreted, delayed, or deliberately ambiguous was never confirmed. What mattered was the reaction. Every side had seen how close the conflict had come to something irreversible. By dawn, the pace slowed, not by agreement, but by exhaustion. Sortie rates dropped, artillery fire became sporadic, naval formations increased separation distances while maintaining readiness. The front lines remained violent, but the surge had passed. The war had reached its inflection point. No side had achieved a decisive breakthrough. No side had suffered collapse. What remained was a region scarred by days of sustained combat and a realization shared quietly across command centers. If the next escalation came, it would not be controllable. And for the first time since the war began, that knowledge began to shape decisions more than ambition.
By October 10th, the war reached the point where continuation promised only disproportionate loss. What remained of initiative was outweighed by risk. Commanders across all theaters confronted the same reality. The next step would not be reversible. The first sign of change appeared in the air. At 0618 local time, sortie rates across the Black Sea theater declined sharply. Aircraft continued to patrol, but engagement distances widened. Intercepts remained aggressive in posture, but conservative in execution. Pilots reported fewer hardened locks and shorter confrontations. The sky did not empty, it loosened. On land, momentum stalled. Russian armored units halted major advances, shifting to defensive postures around newly taken ground. Ukrainian forces mirrored the move, consolidating positions rather than counterattacking. Artillery fire dropped from saturation to response-only patterns. The front lines stopped moving, not by agreement, but by mutual calculation. At sea, restraint became visible. Naval formations increased separation while maintaining overlapping coverage. Missile systems remained active, but fire control radars cycled less frequently. Commanders maneuvered to deny advantage rather than seek it. The Black Sea remained tense, but the rhythm of combat broke. Behind the scenes, diplomacy accelerated. Emergency communication channels reopened through intermediaries with no formal mandate and no public acknowledgement. Messages were short, technical, and stripped of language about victory or blame. They focused on corridors, thresholds, and the prevention of accidental escalation. The most critical exchange occurred late on October 10th. A missile launch detected inland triggered early warning responses across multiple countries. Strategic forces elevated readiness within minutes. Communication lines activated immediately. For 8 minutes, escalation models dominated every decision. The missile impacted harmlessly in a declared test zone. No explanation followed. None was requested. The point had been made, again, and absorbed. On October 11th, the war began to freeze. Major offensive operations ceased across all fronts. Airstrikes became rare and tightly scoped. Naval patrols held distance. Ground fighting diminished to isolated exchanges driven by misinterpretation rather than intent. The battlefield did not fall silent, but its volume dropped unmistakably. NATO and regional forces formalized deconfliction measures without calling them agreements. Flight corridors were clarified, naval operating areas were adjusted, incident prevention protocols were reactivated. The mechanisms were fragile, but they functioned. Casualty estimates exceeded 200,000 across all sides.
Entire regions suffered infrastructure damage that would take years to repair. Ports were damaged, rail networks fractured, and air bases degraded. Civilian displacement spread far beyond the front lines. No territory changed hands decisively. No side claimed victory. What changed was understanding. The conflict demonstrated how quickly regional tension could escalate into something approaching global war without ideology, declarations, or deliberate intent. Geography, momentum, and miscalculation had been enough. In the weeks that followed, forces remained deployed. Exercises were canceled. Doctrines were revised quietly. Defense budgets expanded without debate. Early warning systems were recalibrated not just for capability, but for exhaustion and human error. The Third World War did not arrive in full, but it had revealed its shape. A war driven by speed rather than strategy. A war defined by proximity rather than ideology. A war stopped not by victory, but by the shared recognition that the next escalation would escape control entirely. As autumn settled across the region, soldiers held positions they had fought over days earlier, aware that what followed was not peace, only a pause, and everyone involved understood how thin it was.